we have all these protective strategies that show up, for our benefit often. And if we can view our childhood as all good, then we don't have to relate to what wasn't good. And
Right.
the reality of all things is that most things exist in a gray area. But what trauma does to us is it causes us to view things as black or white, as good or bad.
Welcome to Sib as a Human, where we explore the messy, beautiful, and complex experience of being a sibling to someone with a disability or significant emotional, physical, or behavioral needs, what we call being a sib. I'm Sheena Brevig, and in today's conversation, I sit down with Dr. Sara Rapaport, and we talk about the sibs' nervous system. We touch on why so many sibs intellectualize their way through therapy, and why understanding everything doesn't always make you feel better. We discuss why sibs who grew up in loving families might still feel like something's wrong, and how we're actually all using nervous system regulation and dysregulation incorrectly. Dr. Sara Rapaport is a naturopathic doctor, massage therapist, biofeedback practitioner, and neuroaffective relational model practitioner, specializing in mind-body medicine and the treatment of complex trauma. She is additionally currently training to become a somatic experiencing practitioner. She combines counseling, nutrition, herbal medicine, and physical medicine to support whole person healing and transformation for her patients. In her personal life, she's an avid adventurer, dancer, mover, and loves West Coast swing. She is based in Portland, but grew up in Cincinnati alongside her brother, who was diagnosed with autism at age 3 and GLUT1 deficiency syndrome at age 18. Midway through medical school, she realized how much of her life she had devoted to being a helper at the expense of her own identity, and has since then been on a path of reclaiming her own authenticity and helping others with developmental trauma come home to themselves. I know I learned a lot from this conversation, and it also allowed me to give myself a lot of compassion and a lot of grace for all that my nervous system has carried me through. So I hope this helps you do the same. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, engage with our content so that we can bring you more conversations like this. And you can find Sara's info in the show notes if you want to connect with her as well. Here's my conversation with Sara. Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Would love to start with you actually sharing a bit about your sib identity story and how you came to recognize that being a sib had a significant impact on you and your well-being and how you move through the world.
Yeah, I mean, where do I start here?
It's a small question, right?
Exactly, totally. I'm like, I could answer this in so many ways, but I think when I was a kid, I just kind of thought it was normal. And then I started to realize that maybe other kids weren't having the same experience as me. Like I remember very vivid memories of going to occupational therapy with my brother, going to physical therapy with my brother, kind of being at the hospital a lot. And I think at some point I started to realize maybe that's not the experience that other kids are having. But I don't think I realized until, gosh, I think it took all the way for me to get into medical school, halfway through, to be like, oh, this experience has really impacted me in a lot of ways. And I wasn't really in tune with it. I think in college a little bit, when I first started going to therapy, I was like, okay, I've actually been having this unique experience that I don't know very many other people that have had. But it didn't really hit me until midway through medical school that oh, there's a massive impact from this that I'm only starting to realize. During medical school, so I'm a naturopathic doctor, and so we do things a little bit differently. And I started getting really into nervous system education. We at the school had a mind body medicine department. And so I got really interested in kind of how the nervous system works. And as I was diving more deep into those studies, I started to kind of be aware of my own nervous system and started to recognize oh, I've got a lot of kind of, some of the stuff that's going on that I've been reading about. And kind of being like, where is this from, and starting to realize all the adaptations that I had made from my childhood that had resulted in my nervous system being the way that it was.
So I studied neuroscience undergrad, and I remember being in this brain and behavior course where I ended up having coffee with this professor and asking him a question about the sleep pattern I was experiencing. And he was basically like, yeah, that's chronic stress. And I was like, oh, huh.
Right.
And that was one of the first seeds to be like, maybe things are, maybe I'm not okay.
Right.
But the thing was, that was all I had known, that like default mode of going. So I was like,
Right.
this isn't normal. What do you mean? Like, you're
Right.
telling me this is chronically something, which is concerning.
Well, when it's like the water that you're swimming in, right? You don't know that you're like, that's just my environment. That's just how it is. And then when you actually are able to take some steps back and look at things in kind of a more, bird's eye view, I think it starts to become a little bit more obvious that there is something that is going on in the system.
Okay, so you mentioned the mind-body connection. Can you speak a little bit more to how you think of it?
What has happened in our society is that we've kind of endured this Cartesian split. This is from Descartes' philosophy and everything that, way back in the day before that philosophy existed, we always held mind and body to be interrelated. When the mode of thought started changing around that time, people started kind of believing that the mind and the body were two separate entities and that all processes of the mind were, specific to the mind and had nothing to do with the body and vice versa. And so, that's kind of where we got our current system, where it's like we've got our medical system and we have our mental health system, and they're very split, and there's not a ton of understanding. I think more and more these days there is, but there hasn't been traditionally a ton of understanding of kind of where the middle exists or where these two things interact.
Mm-hmm.
And we can actually see, like we have research about this now around, how does stress impact, autoimmune diseases and activation? How does stress impact, other physical symptoms? We get this a lot. It's just not, well understood or accepted. It's starting to be more, but yeah.
Given we're kind of in a time where some folks like yourself are trying to kind of reintegrate the mind and body, and I know for myself, coming from Eastern cultures as well, where there's a little bit more of a holistic view of wellness, did you notice there was something falling short with just like behavioral talk therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to my own experience around that first and foremost, and then I can kind of talk about like where, we kind of understand from a neuroscience perspective that it could fall
That'd be
short.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from my own experience, like, part of my dissociative strategy is that I'm a really superior intellectualizer. And so it's
Okay,
like,
wait, break that down for me,
yeah,
because I think I
yeah,
am the same, but just so everyone
yeah.
can be on the same page.
I have, it's like I can track my mental experience super well. I have a lot of self-awareness of like, okay, why am I doing that? Why is that happening? Could this be because of this and this and this and this? And there's a way that I can get really stuck up in my head. It's better now, obviously, with lots of therapy and time. But yeah, there's a way that we can kind of get stuck up into the thought around things, which can cause us to be disconnected from the emotionality or like the lived embodied experience of what's happening, which, is an awesome survival strategy for a kid, right? If I can just kind of explain away what's happening, then I don't have to feel the impact of what's actually existing in the moment or what can be so painful.
Ooh, okay. So intellectualizing as a coping mechanism
Yeah, it's
is
so smart.
definitely, yeah, it's so smart. I'm glad we can give ourselves that, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, with all of our survival strategies, part of how I work with them is just like really honoring the intelligence of it. It's like it
Yeah.
is so smart that we do these things, especially as children, to develop these really like big strategies of wisdom. It's like that's kind of amazing that a child would be like, you know what? Like I need to just like make sure that I understand this so I don't have to actually be in the experience of it. There's a lot of intelligence in that.
So that is a way to disassociate.
It can be. Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to be reductionistic about like, because I think then we can enter the space of like, oh, every time I'm up in my head, I'm dissociating. That's not true. But it can be a way to kind of leave the emotional experience. And so that's been a large way that I coped in my childhood. And so here I am sitting in behavioral therapy where it's quite heady and is a lot about how do we necessarily alter the way that we're thinking or change the way that we're doing things to be able to view things differently and relate to things differently. So I was like, I already kind of understand all this. I have this deep intellectual understanding. None of this feels like new information to me. And I think a lot of the clients that I see are kind of in a similar boat where they're like, I get it, like I can track
Mm.
this all. I really understand what happened, but yet I'm not doing better.
Ooh, I relate.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. And the neuroscience kind of explains this, like a lot of behavioral therapies mostly work with our prefrontal cortex. And so, prefrontal
Mm.
cortex is part of our brain that is associated with meaning making and kind of how we relate and process to things in our environment. Um, but trauma is one of those things where it's like it lives partially in the prefrontal cortex in kind of the meaning that we make of things, but it also lives in more of our limbic structures. So that's like the amygdala, the hippocampus. There's a bunch of other smaller structures that are included in that as well. And that's like where our fear responses live and our long-term memory is put down. And so if we're only working with the prefrontal cortex, we're going to miss kind of
Mm.
that embodied feeling of like, I'm really frightened, or, my body has this reaction that I don't totally understand and I can't really explain or attempt to gaslight myself away from. So I think that's where a lot of the behavioral therapies miss the boat a little bit. I'm not the kind of person that generally knocks any kind of therapy. I think that there is a time and place for everything. But I think when we're considering complex trauma, developmental trauma especially, we're often missing the boat if we're only working with the prefrontal cortex.
That makes a lot of sense. And looking back on my history with therapists, I kind of like therapist hopped. Like I would be with a therapist for a little bit and then I'd kind of like graduate and I'd be like, I guess I'm better now. And then I'd like still have these like big emotional reactions. I'd still
Totally.
like nothing really felt different because I was in there being like, yeah, I understand
Totally.
XYZ. I understand what's happening. Like I was really good at intellectualizing things. But I did do a good job of avoiding discussing anything about how I might have been impacted by growing up with a disabled sibling. I was like, no, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing painful about that. I could never say anything negative about that, which, showed up in my body.
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, again, it's like we have all these protective strategies that show up, for our benefit often. And if we can view our childhood as all good, then we don't have to relate to what wasn't good. And
Right.
the reality of all things is that most things exist in a gray area, but what trauma does to us is it causes us to view things as black or white, as good or bad. Um,
Mm.
so, often if we're stuck in viewing something as entirely good or as entirely bad, that's probably a little bit of a signal that, there's some trauma that, exists there.
Can you define trauma for us? Because I think that I have been diagnosed with complex PTSD, but it took me a long time to even accept that because I was like, what do you mean? Like, I had a really good
Yeah.
childhood. My parents are still together and there's a lot of love in my family. I have so much privilege. Like, what do you mean there was trauma? Trauma feels like this big word we use, but from your perspective and through the lens of a SIB, can you help us understand what trauma is?
Yeah, well, I want to distinguish between kind of more shock trauma and complex developmental trauma. Complex trauma is actually a relatively new diagnosis, and we don't actually even have diagnosis codes for it yet. So it's not even in the DSM. Not a lot of people are aware of this. Is like we can't actually diagnose anybody with complex trauma yet.
Oh.
Even though, we know it exists, the only diagnosis that we have is for classic PTSD, and that's more often, associated with shock trauma. It's not always true. There's often a very like deep interwoven combination between shock and complex trauma. But just for the purposes of this,
And when you're saying shock trauma, you're talking about like a big event, like what we think of with like veterans.
totally.
I've also heard like capital T trauma. Is that
Yeah,
the same
I'm not a
idea?
big fan of the capital T and the lower T just because
Ooh,
I think it,
okay.
it kind of it's like it's diminutive when we use a lower T. And I'm like, complex trauma can be sometimes for some folks way bigger than their shock
Mm.
trauma.
Ooh, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like I don't necessarily like to make that distinction of like these are just different types of trauma. And I think people often call it capital T because it's more easily seen, right? If somebody's in a war, if they get bombed, if somebody's in a car accident, it's like we have this evidence, we have this way to look at it to be like, oh, that's what happened to you. complex trauma is kind of, insidious or under the radar a little bit, because the way that I often define it is that it can be, chronic misattunement, chronic neglect, generally not getting the needs that we really need developmentally met by our environment. So that's how subtle it is. And
Right.
it's like, I think, as a sib, especially, I think neglect is also just part of the game, for a lot of
Right.
us, that, our parents often didn't mean to neglect us. But when you have a very high needs person in your household, a lot of the attention is going to go to that person, unless
Yeah.
you have the awareness to be like, okay, how do we actually do this differently? But, most families are in their own nervous system activation sympathetically around what's happening, that they're just trying to survive. And that, often leads towards inattention towards us, the siblings. And our adult brains can understand some of that, right? But as a kid, often the way that we survive is by personalizing that. And what I mean when I say that is like, kids are getting neglected and making it about something being wrong with them. There must be something wrong with me.
Mm.
There must be some deficit in me that I'm not getting attention in the same way that this person is, because that's kind of how child mind works. And so, that's one point that I want to make here. And like, the other point that comes up, there's the difficulty of like, how do we hold that like people are often doing their best and also still hold the charge of what that did to us? And I think that's really, like the golden spot in my therapeutic work is, trying to figure out how to hold both.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes if we end up just being like, they're doing their best, everything, everything was actually just the way that it was, we often cross over our own experience. Um, and it's so easy to do that as a sib because we were trained to do that too, you know,
Right.
to not
Right.
value our own experience. And so it's hard to be like, how do I actually still be angry at this, angry at the environmental failure that happened, while still holding the other side of it of like, yeah, probably, they were doing their best. And how do I still hold my experience, right?
Yeah, it's that nuance and paradox of like, how do we hold love and resentment at the same time?
Totally.
And it's hard and scary. I mean, I'm still on that journey because for me, I bypass anger usually straight to
Yeah.
like frustration and crying. And it's only in the last like year or two where something would happen and I'd be like, "Oh, I'm angry."
Right.
Huh. And I'd be like excited about it. I'm like, "Oh, I'm pissed."
So we have to celebrate those moments.
We do,
Yeah.
because I'm like, I haven't just burst into tears already. This is
Right.
great.
Right.
I'm like feeling the actual thing that's happening. Going back to what you were saying about how a young mind works, where it personalizes things, my therapist is always saying that it's like the most frustrating thing that we create these big ideas of who we are at such young ages.
Yeah. And trauma disrupts how we identify because of that. And so that's often what we're working with when we're in this adult therapy situation, is that I've developed this identification around myself because of what I've experienced and how I related to it, 20, 30 years ago. And here I am in therapy being like, all right, now we're working on how I identified and how that's actually influenced how I show up in the world.
Can you maybe share a bit more about a SIB nervous system?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of theories about this. So, the way that I kind of talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is our part of our nervous system that, is under automatic control on some level, um, is through the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches that we're so familiar with. So, sympathetic is what we normally associate with fight or flight. Parasympathetic, we often know as rest and digest. And we have these new terms that, people are kind of using where we're talking about freeze states, and fawning states. We don't
Mhm.
exactly, have, and at least I don't, maybe some other people listening to this have kind of a better neurological understanding of how those things work. A lot of it is that I hold is just based on theory, and what I see in practice. But generally, like, our nervous system is designed to respond to threat in a very adaptable way. And so, if I come across a wild predator, um,
Hmm.
out in my wild adventures, um, my nervous system is meant to respond to that in a way that is fight or flight, right? Like that's going to help me survive. If I don't have that part of my nervous system, I'm probably just going to get eaten. Um, so we don't want that to happen. So yeah, that is how our nervous system is initially designed to act towards threat. Oftentimes a nervous system that has been, kind of sympathetically activated over and over and over again with no real feeling of result from that will often go into a more frozen state. And some of the theory around that is that that's meant to kind of preserve life function and preserve metabolism and kind of prevent against life threat. So if you act dead, there's this hope that the animal won't kill you. You can see this in animals. It's like gazelles playing dead when a lion gets them in their jaws. It looks like the gazelle is actually dead, and it turns out it's not, but you don't see this until the lion's been distracted by something, and then suddenly it gets up and runs away. It's amazing. Our nervous systems are amazing. Now we're not often facing these predatory animals in the same way that we were in the wild, but we are facing different things. We're facing the stressors of life that have existed now from a more industrial place, from the Industrial Revolution. And so there's traffic, there's taxes, there's all the things that cause us to go into a nervous system reaction, right? So we're reacting to all these things in our environment. Some of them are actually dangerous. Other ones we're perceiving as dangerous because of our relationship that we have to them. And there are a lot of dangers in our environment that aren't as clear cut. Like the things that we experience now are just more complex than what we used to experience when we were more hunter-gatherers. So when we're talking about nervous system regulation, which is a word that's thrown around a lot, I think often the misunderstanding is that, regulation is about a calm nervous system. It's not. It's about a nervous system that knows how to adequately respond and is adequately responding to what's in front of it. So it's actually very regulated for me to be in a sympathetic nervous system response if I'm being met with a tiger. It's very regulated for me to be crying and wailing at a grief ceremony. That's the right place to be doing that. Oftentimes what happens though is that, I come across a tiger and my sympathetic nervous system can't even calm down once the tiger has left many hours after. And that's what we're really calling more dysregulation, is that I'm not able to come back to baseline. And my response is not necessarily consistent with what's happening in my environment anymore.
I think for me, sometimes I've used the word dysregulation, but it's probably activation.
Yeah, it's most often activation when people are saying dysregulation. Basically, it's like when we can't kind of flow between different nervous system states, in accordance with our environment. So like if I'm in a calm environment, my nervous system, if it's in a more regulated place, it should be able to access some level of calm. The dysregulation really comes in where we can't get back.
I used to identify this way as like an anxious person.
Mm-hmm.
But I've learned since that it's not a personality trait, that most likely is my nervous system being kind of stuck in a heightened place and my inability, or my body's inability, to kind of come out of that to fully be able to relax. When we were chatting before, you mentioned that stomach aches are common symptoms in kids.
Yeah.
That are dealing with anxiety. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because that was my experience, where I grew up with so many stomach aches, and then that turned into a whole slew of stomach issues in adulthood.
Totally. Kids are often not so great at describing their experience. Sometimes it also comes down to wanting to protect the family too. So oftentimes a kid doesn't necessarily want to be like, I'm really nervous about what's happening in my house right now, because that puts it into a lot of reality and a lot of fear. And so oftentimes, kids aren't experiencing those symptoms on kind of a mental, emotional level. They get belly aches.
Mm.
So it's one of those things that, one of my mentors always talked about, and what I've seen in practice is that, oftentimes if a kid has a bellyache, there can be something more mental emotional going on. There could also be physical symptoms too, but we always have to evaluate like, oh, is this bellyache actually more about anxiety, or more about some trauma that this child is experiencing that is manifesting in this way?
For folks who have kids that might be in that space, what are kind of the first steps that you recommend?
I always advocate for like really open conversations between parents and kids. We often didn't grow up that way as millennials.
Yeah.
But these days I'm like, okay, there's some different education around that. Really talking to kids about, okay, like when do we notice your belly starts to hurt? Like, can we kind of figure out what that is in response to? Asking questions like, okay, when this happens in our family, does that, does something happen inside of you? Do you have a reaction to that? So really having like lots of open conversations with kids around, here's what's happening in the family. Like, how are you taking that? I really
Yeah.
advocate for a very relational approach with kids, because often kids don't, they don't want to upset their parents. They want to be good. Sibs, I think, can relate to that big time. It's like we want to be so good that you don't want to have a problem. And so sometimes parents really have to kind of get into it deeply to be like, it's actually okay for you to have a problem here, because that can be really healing, to be like, it's actually okay to have problems. We all do. And like, thanks for bringing it to the table so that we can actually be here and address it and care for it.
And how do you approach that with now those of us who have already grown up, who've already been
Yeah.
through those times, who can't go back to that, but we can still do something
I
now?
would love to work with more sibs. I would say I specialize in working with a lot of folks that have experienced chronic neglect. And so that's kind of the place that I can speak from. Oftentimes, like if we were neglected as children, we learn how to do that to ourselves. So we learn a pattern of self-neglect.
Ooh, wait, can you say that one more time?
Yeah. So often if we were neglected as children, we learn how to neglect ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Oof, that makes me emotional.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we had so many sibs speak to that of just the difficulty to ask for help, the difficulty to put ourselves first, and the ease with which we put our needs aside and prioritize everything else around us and everyone else's needs.
Yeah, so I would say like in my work, when I'm working with folks that have been neglected, it's about how do we bring these needs to the surface? Like, how do we start to relate to ourselves as humans with needs, as humans that are deserving of care, and to have our needs met, which is often a process, right? It's like we have to even get to the place where it's like, I'm a person with needs. Sometimes it's so buried deep that it's like, I don't have any needs. I'm fine. I'm
It's
fine.
I think that's a classic sib thing. It's like, what needs?
Totally. I
Me?
know.
No.
I experienced that too. I'm like, this is, at kind of the beginning of my therapy journey, I was like, I'm fine. What's up with you?
Yeah.
Like so
Exactly.
well oriented towards the other person. And so it's
Right.
like, it's about bringing the orientation back to self. And, I do a lot of relational work with folks. And so it's like, how do we sit here together and have me actually hold relational space with you where it is just about you and about me relating to you through that context? Um, and of course, that can sometimes be uncomfortable too. It's like, I've never put the spotlight on me. And suddenly it's here. And what do I even do with it? So we have to often titrate that experience of like, we can't just like shine the spotlight on a person that's never had the spotlight on them and have that feel okay. It's like we have to take that in small doses often.
I wonder if that's part of what happened to me, where it was like suddenly the spotlight was turned on me in this way that was I just wasn't ready for.
Right, right.
And it was too much. And I was like, nope, can't look at that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not real.
Yeah, totally. Like our strategies in that way is like we are often protecting something that is so tender that we have to be
Hmm.
super, super careful about how we approach it. And oftentimes if it's like I'm knocking at the door too hard, you're gonna be like, nope, like the door needs to
No
be
one's
closed.
home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No one's home, don't even look for me.
Wow. Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to what's happening when adults are like, I don't have needs and also I don't even know what I want to eat.
Yeah, you're speaking to it. If I have disconnected from myself in the way in which I've disconnected from my needs and my wants, it does become very hard to feel those things. Unless we're able to kind of find a pathway back. And often it's quite simple. Occasionally I've worked in my office to be like, cool, what objects do you like around my room? Can you like pick some that look interesting to you? To even just start at that place to be like, oh, I like the shiny crystal. I like the color of this. It's like we're starting at kind of the basic place where that development might have been disrupted. That's where kids start, right? Kids are like, I like my truck toy. Never take my truck toy away from me. Kids are very clear about what they like and what they don't like. But as sibs, my suspicion is that that probably gets disrupted around the age in which, we were supposed to develop those skills. So in a way, we kind of have to start there to be like, let's just work with like the simplicity of it, because at least in my experience, when there's too much noise and too many things happening, it makes it harder sometimes for me to really feel what I needed from the environment. So the simpler it is and the simpler that I can make it, is often easier for me to feel like, oh yeah, this is for me, this isn't for me.
Gosh, I've like so many questions. What are maybe some signs and symptoms based on kind of the mind-body connection, based on the nervous system, that would indicate someone is maybe stuck in, I guess, sympathetic activation?
I would say like I see all sorts of folks. Sympathetic activation is one of the ones where I see people spend a lot more time than ideal. And for folks that are kind of in a more sympathetically dominant state, what they generally notice is that there's kind of a feeling of adrenaline in them a lot. That can sometimes show up as like heart racing. That can show up sometimes as racing thoughts. So sometimes the symptoms that we associate with anxiety can be kind of very commonly looped in.
Yeah.
People that are kind of feeling angry all the time too. Again, like anger is a really good emotion, but if you're feeling angry persistently all the time, sometimes that can mean that you're in kind of a sympathetically activated state. So, that's sometimes more of that sympathetic activation. Some people can notice digestive symptoms with that too.
That was my journey for sure.
Totally, because it will change your transit time. So when we're in a sympathetic state, our body is not like, you know what I really need to do right now? Digest my food. So the body basically shunts all your blood towards the muscles that are made for running, and the blood goes away from your intestines. So it's going to impact your intestinal ability to be digesting food. And so I see that very often in folks that have kind of a more sympathetic dominant situation going on in their nervous system, is like food digestion is not working well. And so that's part of it. Sometimes I do see folks that are in kind of what we would think of as like a more freeze state. Digestion also doesn't work well in that state because the body is kind of like, we're down for business right now.
We're just shutting down.
Yeah. But more often when folks are in that state, kind of symptomology is more like depression and apathy, and kind of like sluggishness. Sometimes kind of chronic fatigue is kind of a syndromal manifestation of a chronic frozen state. So those are kind of like the basics, but it's like it's so much more nuanced than that. But if I'm going to be a little bit more basic about it,
we got to start somewhere. If any of these things are resonating with someone listening, what might their next steps be to start addressing this?
Yeah, I mean, going to practitioners that have an understanding of the mind-body connection, seeking out therapists that are specialized in complex trauma. Obviously, not everybody operates the same way. Like therapy is not a monolith. There's so many different types of therapy that work on so many different things. But generally, like going in that sort of direction is helpful. My soapbox that I stand on very often is that I think this relates to sibs a lot, is like I do relational therapy. And the reason that I do that is because a lot of the trauma that folks incur that step into my office was relational. And so I think that you need to have a highly relational approach for relational trauma. And that's just my soapbox. Take it or leave it, folks that are listening. But I really strongly believe in that, is that like we heal in relationship. And having a good relationship with your practitioner, whoever they are, is like the first vital step. It's like we can't heal in a place where we don't really like feel held or trusting of the people that are trying to help us.
Totally, totally. For those of us on this journey of trying to get our nervous systems more regulated and able to respond appropriately to the things that are happening around us, what does it feel like to have a regulated nervous system? What's kind of the goal that we're headed towards if all we've known is the waters we've swum in the whole time, we're all a little bit activated?
It's a tough question to answer because, I think with, it's like if we expand our awareness to everything that's happening in the world too, it's like, can any of us be fully regulated right now? And so I think everything is kind of relative here. Is like, what's a relatively regulated nervous system? What's being able to access all of these different states in the moment that I need them, more or less. I'm still working on this in myself too. So I'm like, I don't know if I can really speak 100% to like, I don't know too many people that have fully arrived there. And so I think it's just like, it's a bit of a spectrum on some level of, have I definitely made massive strides from where I used to be to now? Like even, being able to cry in public was a thing that I wasn't able to do before, and now I can do it. And so that was a really big deal for me. You know, I'm going to the rage room on Saturday with some friends because that's like a helpful thing for my anger practice. It's like, can I channel some of that? And so, I think, being the thing that I can say is like, when we have more acceptance of all of the experiences that we're having internally and have more allowance for, yeah, this is what's happening in me and there's nothing wrong with it. Whether that's anger, whether that's grief, whether that's elation, whether, we can name any of these human experiences. But I think something really starts to shift in us when we can continue to try to make as much spaciousness for all of it, for like the grand experience of what it is to be human.
I feel like as a society, we tend to shove down anything that we feel like is a bad emotion, right? We've decided that certain ways of being are better, or like we must be happy all the time. And that's not the human experience.
No.
And I think for myself too, I really identified with like, yeah, I'm going to always be really positive. And then that just meant I was like not feeling a lot of feelings.
Totally.
The journey of like peeling back the layers of being like, oh, sometimes I am going to be really grumpy, or I'm going to be really upset and really angry and really resentful. And like, to your point of like allowing someone to witness that, whether that was a therapist or like a close friend or a partner, like, oh, that journey has been so painful. But when it's been the right person where I felt safe and I felt held, it has felt like I'm exhaling like for the first time almost.
Totally.
And that has been huge for me.
I got a little bit of chills hearing you say that.
Aw.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's not an easy journey out here to be a whole human.
No, it is not. Especially as sibs, it's like there is something that you're speaking to that is so healing, to be in the experience of, I can be having this really messy looking experience and people can still love me and want me to be here.
Oh, yep. This is going to come out after my birthday, but I will just say I've been trying to plan my birthday and it has been the most difficult thing. Like I've cried multiple times trying to plan my birthday. It's hilarious and ridiculous. And also like, I'm like, wow, okay, I guess there's more work to do.
I can totally relate to that. I was also born on Christmas Eve, so there's an extra complication to my birthday. But I'm always just like, I don't know how to celebrate myself. How do I do this? Like, I've had so many meltdowns around my birthday too, so I get it.
Yeah, birthdays seem to be complex for a lot of people, but I feel like being a sib and that whole idea of like, I don't even know what I want. People are like, what kind of cake do you want? I'm like, I don't know.
Totally.
It's like, I have a whole crisis around that. But it's okay. I requested a fruit tart. But like, how hilarious that even telling you this, I'm like, is it okay for me to say that? Is it okay for me to like
totally
have an opinion about what I want? Thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's wild. When we were chatting before, you had mentioned there were maybe some tools. I'm just wondering, like, if you can speak to some tools and give that context as well for folks that are also kind
Yeah.
of looking to maybe just start a simple practice.
I don't give a lot of tools in my practice. What I would convey to sibs, especially, is that my therapist actually calls it a self-cleaning oven. When you learn how to become a self-cleaning oven, we don't want to overly promote that. And so that can sometimes be the danger of tools is like, oh, I'm just going to figure out how to heal my nervous system myself and do all these things by myself in my little cocoon, and then I'll be healed and then everyone will love me.
Oh, I feel so called out, and I feel like a lot of other sibs are going to feel called out right now.
I'm so sorry, dear sis. I love all of you. And I've also been this person. I've also been this person. So I know in my own way, like what that's been like. It's so much more frightening to engage in relational healing. You're seen, like
Mm.
there's so much different stuff that happens in that space. So what I ultimately advocate for is that, but I also in the moment sometimes we are in such an activated state that we need something to be able to just like calm us down. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that's kind of where I will sometimes employ some tools with folks. Somatic experiencing is one of the kind of primary places that I take some tools from, with credit to Peter Levine and the whole SE team. But one of the things that SE uses a lot is this practice called orienting. And that's just allowing our eyes to wander where they wander in our environment. And so I often advocate for people to go outside and take a walk and just let their eyes drift and see what they see. And, often we're met with these beautiful things in our environment, birds, trees, things like that. So basically, like the way that that impacts the nervous system is that if we're looking around all kind of like dreamy eyed, essentially, that helps us know that we're safe. We're not going to do that
Mm.
if we're in danger. So we're using our eye movements to orient our brain towards safety. So it's a really simple practice, right? You can do it in your office, you can do it anywhere.
I'm familiar with that like grounding exercise where
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to find, something that's a certain color or find all the five senses
Mm-hmm.
grounding. Is it like that? Like, are you orienting and then are you trying to like name things you're seeing?
So that combines orienting and kind of like a little bit of prefrontal cortex activation in the same thing. So it kind of helps ground you a little bit. The orienting is like, it's a little bit more open when I'm like, okay, I'm going to give you a task to name 5 blue things in this room. It kind of helps our task oriented brain get online. And that can often it's kind of like a different track on the record or something. It can kind of help
Okay.
us get into a more kind of grounded state. So yes, that can be helpful too, like anything that kind of helps us orient towards more present moment awareness. Sometimes if something is happening in the present moment that's too activating, we also want to be a little bit careful about kind of what we're doing in terms of orientation and things like that. And then we have, Peter Levine developed some noises too that are like, vagus kind of activating noises. One of the
Oh.
noises that we use often is the VU noise. So that's a noise that's made kind of in the deep belly and kind of is like a deep throat sound. So it sounds like VU. It's kind of like a humming. And some of the theory with that is that we have a branch of the vagus nerve that kind of goes through our larynx. And so when we hum, when we sing, it can, vibrate and stimulate that. And, the vagus nerve gets a lot of press these days. It's like everything
Mhm.
vagus nerve. It's not the whole story, but I do find that humming and singing and kind of like deeper noises can be really helpful for folks, especially folks that are in more of a frozen kind of state. Sometimes that VU noise is enough to kind of bring them a little bit out of it. There's no one size fits all, unfortunately, for all of these things. So, I can't just be like, VU's going to work for everyone. But, overall, those are some kind of like simple tools that I'll use in my practice. And, often what I'm doing is like really assessing where somebody's at in the moment and trying to be like, okay, like what's actually the most helpful thing in this moment for this person, which is often super, super specific to them and maybe something that I wouldn't even do with anyone else.
I'm curious, if there's any thoughts or anything you'd say to sibs who are on this journey with us. Any messages that you have to share?
I guess I'm trying to think of like, what would I have wanted to hear before I went on this journey? And I think I probably would have wanted to know that I wasn't alone and that like the experiences that I was having weren't abnormal. And even now, I'm like, yeah, there's so much more myth to dispel in my own system around none of this is really abnormal. This is all understandable and adaptable responses to the experiences that we've been through. You learned how to adapt in like a really beautiful way. And, we're all on this journey to figure out how to rely less on our adaptation strategies and have other options available to us.
Thank you. The one last thing is I wanted to ask you if there's anything you are celebrating, because sibs end up not celebrating themselves pretty often. Is there something that you are celebrating that we can celebrate with you?
I think like my biggest celebration is just everywhere I'm leaning in more in life. I love dancing and like sometimes I'm like, wow, like I'm so bad at this. And like to not just be like, okay, I'm gonna quit now. Like to keep leaning in is like such a celebration for me to be like, yep, gonna keep staying engaged, gonna keep messing up. There is a joy in that to just allow myself to really just not be perfect and to keep learning. Yeah.
I love that. Yes, we will definitely celebrate that with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was so wonderful, and I feel like I learned so much.
Oh, yeah, such a pleasure, Sheena. It's such a delight to be with you and to be on this podcast and to be part of this community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in to Sib as a Human. Please subscribe, like, rate, and comment to let us know what resonated with you. And the more engagement we have from listeners, the more we can bring to you all as well. Connect with us on Instagram at Sib as a Human and subscribe to our Substack to be the first to know when new episodes, articles, and resources drop. All of these links are also in our show notes. We are currently making this show with very little funding, so if you feel so inclined, we have a donation page if you want to support Sibs and this project. If you have ideas or other ways that we can bring this podcast and community to more people, please email us at sibasahuman@gmail.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time, and until then, be gentle with yourself.